Welcome to Elixir Wizards, a podcast brought to you by SmartLogic, a custom web and mobile development shop based in Baltimore. This season's theme is working with Elixir, and today we're talking about training and functional programming with Saša Juric. How are you doing, Saša?
Hi, fine, thank you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Super glad to have you. As always, my name is Justice Epen. I am one of the co-hosts of this show. I'm joined by my other co-host, Eric Ostrich. How are you, Eric?
Doing good.
So, Saša, we're really excited to have you on the show. You're your household name in the Elixir circle sphere of developers. So I wanted to start off with a question because everyone is familiar with your blog, the Erlangelist. You've been using Elixir since 2013. You must have been one of the very first people to use it. The question is, how did you discover Elixir? What were you doing when you discovered Elixir, and how did you stumble upon it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I started actually, let me go just a few years earlier. I started working in Erlang, with Erlang in 2010. And so back then Elixir didn't even exist. As far as I know, there wasn't a single line of code, and Jose still didn't read Bruce's book and didn't, have this vision. And anyway, after working for a few years, there were some things which I really loved about Erlang. And then, some things which, maybe I didn't like so much, and I started looking for alternatives and kind of bumped into Elixir for the very first time, maybe, 2011, 12 probably. And back then it was still, when you go to history, you can maybe find it in Git, it was still quite object-oriented. So the early version of Elixir was somehow, it had I think prototype inheritance and stuff like that. And anyway, I saw it looked promising, but I didn't really start doing anything with it. It's kind of funny that you mentioned the blog with this question, because when I started blogging in early 2013, I figured I wanted to spread the word about Erlang, but I figured, if people see that code, people who are not from the Beam community, many of them would just run away. Not because Erlang syntax is horrible or anything, but simply because it's unusual, with its Prolog roots. And so I took another look at Elixir. And I got to say at this point, so this was, if I remember correctly, version 0.7 maybe. And I was absolutely blown away, how mature it looked. It already had documentation. It had onboarding for people coming from Erlang. I started playing with it for the purpose of the blog, and I was so excited with it, and I was so pleasantly surprised. I didn't really expect it, and I basically introduced it in production not soon after that in the system that we had based on Erlang. And I got to say here that this is super untypical of me. I'm not an early adopter of things. I tend to be very conservative, but it was so mature, because basically Elixir back then, and I would say even still today, it's essentially a thin layer on top of Beam. When you compare Beam to Elixir, there is so much more stuff happening in Beam and OTP, and especially then when it was in its early phases, so that I was pretty confident that it's not something risky, because you're ultimately running on top of Beam.
So I want to talk a little bit about your book, but before we get there, I'm going to read to you a little bit out of actually the preface of the book. It says that, this is you speaking, "Soon I started using Elixir to develop new features for my Erlang-based system." This is, I guess, probably 2013. A few months later, I was contacted by Michael Stevens of Manning, who asked me if I was interested in writing a book about Elixir. At the time, 2 Elixir books were already in the making. After some consideration, I decided there was space for another book that would approach the topic from a different angle, focusing on Elixir, concurrency, and the OTP way of thinking. I am amazed that you can have been using a language for months and be contacted to write a book about it. Can you talk about that a little bit? How did that opportunity present itself?
Yeah, that was a pretty big stroke of luck. I like to say that I was in a good virtual place at the right time, because I started, my original plan was to blog about Erlang. I was kind of frustrated. So here in Croatia, we are a much smaller community. Basically wanted to spread the word more to my friends and co-workers rather than to the outer world. And I figured, since I'm blogging, let's start blogging in English. And then this dragged me to Elixir, and I started blogging about Elixir at the time when I was maybe one of the 5 people, maybe 10 most, who were blogging publicly about Elixir. So there weren't so much people talking about it back then. And then what happened a few months later, Dave Thomas announced the book. I think for me, this was a pretty huge surprise. One could tell I was back then on the mailing list. Before Dave Thomas announced anything, there was maybe 10 people on the list, with 9 of us asking questions and Jose providing answers. And, after Dave announced the book, you could just see this influx of people. And I believe that many of people who are like influential, so to speak, in the community came with that first wave. And I guess my theory is that, what happened is Manic picked up the buzz, because there were 2 books in the making all of a sudden, and they were looking for authors. You don't really have a big pool of people for such a young language. And, I jokingly say that, probably out of those other 5 people, I'm the only one who accepted the offer.
Well, I think we as a community are pretty glad that you accepted, because pretty much everyone we've talked to has said that your book is the best one out there. Is there any reason like why you would think that it would stand above everyone else's?
Okay, yeah. So, it's always nice to hear such comments, but I just want to clarify that I personally don't believe that it's best. Rather, I don't believe in things like best versus worse or better versus worse. So this is what says in that statement which you read justice earlier. I wanted to, just fill a different kind of space. So yeah, I think it's a complementary book to other books, like most notably Dave's programming Elixir. I often read that people read those 2 books combined, and they recommend those 2 books combined. So yeah, I don't even think they compete. And so talking about better versus worse doesn't really make sense, But yeah, basically, when Manning contacted me, I had to like figure out a way. Like, what am I going to do? Dave is writing a book, and clearly I cannot do a better job than that, And basically, to keep my own sanity and to make this effort worthwhile, because writing, takes a lot of time, I decided I'm going to attack, this space which seems that, Dave is not going to treat as extensively as, say, other kind of topics. And that's what I did. And that's what I get, the most positive feedback about. And so these would be the parts 2 and 3, so concurrency and OTP. Personally, I like the way this story unfolds in those second and third part. So, like the first part is kind of sluggish. It's more like, declarative. You have this, you have that, and so on. And so you kind of have to survive this first part. But then the story really picks up and things build on top of each other. And so one trick that I did, which I personally like about the book, is that I tend to, I sort of describe my own mistakes and let you learn from my mistakes, even by making those same mistakes, in the sense that, like in, say, one chapter, you will write some naive concurrency implementation, and then you feel good about yourself at the end of the chapter. And then at the beginning of the next chapter, I explain, what are the problems with it, And so we tear it apart and we add something new. And then in the next chapter, then I tell you, and this is also wrong because of some other things, And so it's not like a straight vertical line from start to finish. It's more like a zigzag pattern, which is, by the way, quite realistic. This is literally what I did on my own when I was, working with Erlang, because back then we had much less resources. Like when I started, even Fred's book, Learning Some Erlang, wasn't available as far as I remember. So I had to, learn a lot of stuff from my own mistakes, and I basically wanted to kind of save you that trouble, but at the same time show you, why are we doing those things? Not just, you should do it like this, but also explain the reasoning and the context behind it.
So I want to ask a little bit more about the book, but I kind of want you to extrapolate to a different concept, which is my read of Elixir in Action is that it is targeted at, it's for intermediate and advanced developers, right? To put it simply, I don't think an entry-level developer would have a super easy time understanding the concepts that are working their way through. I'm curious, like, do you have, and when I say entry-level, I mean like super fresh out of college, or even, going into a CS program. Do you have any thoughts on how you would introduce the programming concepts in Elixir to novice programmers, to people who don't know how to program?
Yeah, so first, I agree with you. So Elixir in Action definitely assumes that the reader is otherwise an expert programmer, like not super expert, but you basically know things like loops and stuff like that, functions and so on. And in that sense, it definitely doesn't work for a novice programmer. I would say that maybe Dave's book is certainly better in that regard. And speaking about worse versus better, here's a true anecdote or a true story. For my current clients, very big things. I hope that we're going to later speak a little bit more about what I'm doing there. But one part of the story is that I shaped the onboarding program for the new people, so like the literature that they are supposed to be reading. Funnily enough, I included Dave's book, but I didn't include Elixir in Action, not because I think Elixir in Action is worse or something, but because essentially they are working more with functional aspect of, Elixir, and they are also working a lot with Absinthe and Ecto and Phoenix, and these libraries hide all this OTP and Gen servers and supervisors behind the scene, and so they don't need to focus so much on that aspect, and they need to focus on other aspects. So, I would say, but this is still, in the expert space. I would say that Dave's book to me seems gentler to, people coming to the language. But when it comes to completely new programmers, I feel that this is a space that still hasn't been properly attacked, so to speak. One book that I'm aware of is by Ryan Big. It's called Joy of Elixir. I didn't read it. I don't know if it's like for sale or is it finished, what's the status of it. But I remember that Ryan announced it like maybe 2 years ago or something like that. And it is specifically targeting, people who are completely new to programming. That's the only resource that I can think of. And so this is like, I think, a big problem or something that someone, needs to do.
What do you think the gap is? Like, what Elixir seems like a very syntactically friendly language along the lines of Ruby. What is it just a matter of time that the ecosystem hasn't matured yet, or are there things fundamental to Elixir that are challenging for a non-programmer to grok?
So I don't think it should be a problem, except, someone needs to make that effort, because basically the people completely new to programming, have to grok variables and functions and return values and conditionals and loops and stuff like that. One could argue that actually learning Elixir should be easier for them than for us coming from object-oriented paradigm. We had to unlearn a lot of stuff. I did like quite a lot of bad things, which I'm not even willing to publicly admit, especially in my early Erlang days, So, and those people are completely, fresh, open minds, and they just need to be taught that. But basically, all the material that we have, for better or worse, one could say probably worse, assumes that the reader is, somehow educated programmer, to some extent. And yeah, it's basically lacking, other than Ryan's book. But, I don't really know what's the status of the book itself. Maybe also there is a book published by Prague. It's called Learn Functional Programming with Elixir. So again, I haven't read this book, but at least, from what I've kind of seen from the outline, it also seems like it could be kind of geared toward people who are, less familiar with programming in general.
Yeah, I definitely did some bad object-oriented things when I first started with Elixir. But I guess moving on from that, you sort of mentioned that you work at Very Big Things. Who is that, and what do you do there?
So Very Big Things is a digital agency. So they basically, do like software on order, so to speak. Companies come to them, they want to build some kind of software, they don't have their own development, and then Very Big Things, builds product for them, custom-made, tailor-made products in different domains. Like there are examples in e-learning, in health, for example. So things like that, a bunch of different kind of systems or web apps, if you will. These apps are admittedly not like anything on Twitter scale or Amazon scale, as it usually goes in the agency. They are more like, I would say, small to low, medium sized, shorter projects. So you have like initial bursts of development in the early months, and then things become more stable and maybe less actively developed, but still maintained. Yeah, Very Big Things contacted me. It's now about, I think, 8 months I've been working with them. They've been existing, for, I think, maybe a year or two before that. And they basically, what they did is they did a bunch of things right, So one of them is that they separated the development between front end and back end. So, you're either a front end or a back end developer. I believe that it makes sense, in my few years ago, I would disagree with that approach, but these days, the technologies are so complex that I believe that, splitting those roles makes sense. And they standardized technology stack or the languages on both sides. And in particular on backend, they use exclusively Elixir, And so they've been shipping already some products or some software, before my time. They've shipped them successfully. But somehow, internally, the team felt that something is off, like, in the code. They weren't really sure, how they're supposed to be writing things. They tried out different approaches. They weren't really completely clear, what worked, what didn't. They needed someone to kind of ground them, to, maybe focus them on how things should be done. And also to try to establish common patterns and code style, things like that between different projects. Because, a single project itself in an agency is not challenging, but the business of an agency as a whole is challenging because, you have a lot of dynamics. So, today you're working on one project and maybe tomorrow you switch to another. who someone else wrote. And so you want that code to be kind of as close as possible, so that you don't really have to spend time figuring out different code idioms and whatnot. I mean, the domain is of course going to be different, but the code itself, of course, should resemble as much as possible. It should be clear to everyone, not just, like I look at your code and think it's crap, and you look at my code and think it's crap. That sucks, especially in such a dynamic environment such as agency. And so, we've been working a lot on that pretty much for the past 8 months, so trying to establish some common, I'm not going to really say architecture, but basically patterns and designs in software and practices and things like that.
Can you talk a little bit? Well, first of all, I think the question is like, how many people are you operating with over there?
That's a good question because it changes, but roughly the backend team now is, I think, about 10 people, give or take.
Okay. So you're working with about 10 people. You're trying to manage moving them toward a more conventional style of programming Elixir. Can you talk a little bit like more specifically about how you determine what is a convention, what is an idiom? Maybe speak about specific idioms that you maybe hammer home first or were the most important when you were getting started in the role?
Yeah. So, of course, I mean, this is really a slippery slope. We often, just when we discuss, we say this is idiomatic and no, this is idiomatic. And like, who gets to decide what's idiomatic? So I usually, classify things from what I've seen in the practice. And so I can say, I didn't really see this thing being done so often. But I would say even more important than that is like thinking about what does it bring? Is this pattern useful, in the grand scheme of things? Like, does it clarify things, or does it make sure that, maybe code is more reliable or something like that? So we try to think in that nature. But maybe going back to the second part of the question, maybe let me tell you a little bit about how the mode of operation goes. Essentially, when I came there, I knew that what I wanted to do is basically going to revolve around pull requests and constant code review. So this was like the most, or the first thing that I wanted to introduce. I don't really like, I had those experiences in the past when I was like more a junior programmer, when, some big name or big architect would come and they would draw some boxes and establish some, enterprise bus or something like that, and then they would go away. So I didn't want to do such abstract things. I wanted to be close to the code. I wanted to review and see, the problems that they're facing. And obviously, of course, I spent some time reading the existing code that they had. And so, the thing that we established was code review, where I basically take a look at what are they doing. To make that work, we introduced a lot of, some automatic checks, such as checking for warnings on the CI or doing checking for formatting. And then maybe most importantly, Credo, like literally, you're familiar with Credo both, right? Yeah. So Credo is literally like our style guide. Our style guide document, it's markdown, so I don't know how many pages it has, but it's not long. And I would say that 80% of that document explains how to set up Credo and, how to use it, what's the purpose. And then there is maybe 1 or 2 mechanical rules in the style guide, which so far I wasn't able to enforce with Credo. I mean, it goes to say that those mechanical rules are actually not followed. You forgot about them, because you have to always keep in mind to do stuff that you cannot be enforced with tooling, So we are using Credo as much as you can. Like I saw a couple of different things which I don't like. So for example, alias foo as bar, or maybe alias foo.bar as foobar, So they had a bunch of those things previously, and I pretty much banned the usage of alias as. And I rarely like to speak in absolutes, but I would say that alias as is probably, I can't think of a single example ever when I have used it or where I would find it useful. So we introduced a custom Credo check to verify this on the CI, of course. And we submitted that check to the upstream to the Credo project. We also introduced, for example, a Credo check, which verifies the module layout. So the module layout itself is consistent. Like you start with module doc, if you use that, and then you have use, and then import, and then require, and then alias, then types, public functions, and so on and so forth. This one is also pending for Credo upstream as we speak. That's definitely one important thing. But those are all like little things in the grand scheme of things, So I used to be actually an opponent of both automatic formatters and linters, because I believe that they don't actually help the code clarity. I mean, you can have the code which follows all the linter rules, and you can have properly formatted code which is still like incomprehensible piece of crap or pile of crap, And at the same time, you can have code which has like some custom formatting that is still easy on the eye, and you're failing some linter checks, but the code is beautiful to read. So there is like a weak correlation between the two. But the big point of those tools is to get these minor nitpicks out of the picture. So like when I look at the code review, I don't have to worry about those things. And not just me, everyone is reviewing. So the reviewer basically can focus on the actual things, on the actual proper big issues. So I kind of turned my thinking about those things, and now I'm a huge fan of Credo. I think it's one of the most indispensable tools in our ecosystem. But yeah, then basically when it comes to sort of code design, the big idea is basically we try to go with Phoenix contexts. And what this really means is we want to separate interface logic we want to separate domain level logic from the interface logic, which is, like we are using GraphQL, otherwise maybe you'd be using REST. So those things shouldn't be mixed. Also, I have introduced type specifications for public API functions because I believe that types are first and foremost about documenting, explaining what actually is the thing that is coming into the function and what is the function returning back. When I was looking the code before that, you would have a lot of uncertainties and entropy, if you will. Like you read the code and you're not really sure if something coming in is a map or is it a keyword. And then they had a bunch of these nil checks, basically defensive programming, which you add as you go along. Like you're not really certain if something can be nil or not. And I remember I was just reading, some small single piece of functionality, single small use case. And it took me like an hour or two to figure it out. And then I could tell that a bunch of these if checks were completely redundant. The thing could not be nil. But you cannot really tell that when you're looking at, there's no type specifications, there's nothing. And so it's kind of hard to look at that. And so we grounded this, the whole idea, the big idea, and it's not really so complex, is that the system should be described and understandable at the context level, at the level of the domain, of the intended behavior. So when you look at the context and the functions, you see those functions, which are essentially use case operations. You see the types, so they tell you what's coming in, what's coming out. And based on that alone, you can already get a huge grasp about the system itself.
So you do use Dialyzer as a rule on projects?
Yeah, so we use Dialyzer on CI. I got to say that, Dialyzer is it is way less than perfect. And this is a huge understatement, So I started first using Dialyzer maybe 6 years ago. And in my first year, this was such a pain. I would sometimes spend 4 hours figuring out what exactly is wrong. So once you get over that cliff, it actually becomes kind of easier. And now most often I can, figure out problems pretty quickly. And if it's some intricate problem in a library, maybe it takes me about an hour, which isn't bad, given that we're talking about the Dialyzer, So yeah, we're using Dialyzer, but as I said, it's far from perfect. It's often silent, so it basically doesn't often report possible issues. And then when it does, it gives you this huge spit out of, something. And somewhere in there is, in fact, typically the information that you need, but it's really hard to figure out what is it telling you. But I mean, it's the only thing or the best thing we have to keep specs in check. And specs are the important thing. Specs are the documentation. We want to have at least some assurance that those specs are correct. And Dialyzer does a relatively good job.
So one of our past guests was Chris Keithley, and he's been working on something called Norm. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to look at that as a Dialyzer alternative.
Yeah, I had a chance to look at that. I'm kind of sorry that Chris is now not here. I think that we would hear a long rant about how Norm does not aim to substitute specs and Dialyzer. Norm is a super interesting project. It's what word would I say? It's very close for me. I'm very close to using it, So not just on the roadmap, but something that I really want to give a try someplace. Ultimately, though, basically, I would agree with Chris. We had recently an exchange about it on Elixir forum that, those are two different things operating at different level. So Norm is a very rich kind of checker, but it operates at runtime ultimately. Dialyzer and type specs are, compile time checks. And so what that means is that one, in my view, I'm not really sure that Norm can become useful to the point where I will not need specs. Because again, specs are documentation, so it limits the amount of possibilities. When you have, for example, function accepting params, what are params? What is that? Is it a map? Is this a keyword? What are possible keys? What are possible values? There's like a huge amount of uncertainty. And to understand that, you have to go through the call step deep down to figure out what goes on. Specs basically, narrow it down to the point where you say, okay, it is a keyword list. I can have a key foo and I can have a key bar. And the first one is a string and the second one is an integer. And you already know so much more, like a bunch of hypotheses go off the table. Norm kind of can do this. Ultimately, it's a runtime check. And so what this means is that you can still enter, or you will enter this function, well, not the function, but the wrapper that Norm builds with some invalid parameters, which Norm will then discard. But ultimately, this means that if I write like a runtime check of my own, there's a possible bug in there, and I have to test the function with invalid inputs. In contracts, when I'm writing specs, when I say like this thing accepts integers, I will not even test it with strings because that's basically an invalid input for me. So also there's a question of integration with tooling, although my impression is that Chris has some plans for that. So, specs are super cool integrated with tooling. So you see them in generated docs, you see them in IEX helper output when you do H some function, for example. You see them in VS Code if you're using Elixir language server, and like reading the code. I spent a couple of years, my first few years, writing and reading the code without specs, and then after specs. And for me, there is like no doubt, specs are way, way better. They make it much more easier to understand the code, to figure it out. And they can also help figuring out design problems, because when you see a spec, you can sometimes see that design itself of the API is not well thought out or well separated.
Can you talk a little bit about how you use them in your workflow, or how you implement them in your workflow? Are you writing the spec after you've implemented the function, or are you writing the spec as a part of the design process?
So I personally write it after I implement, not even a function, so somewhere near the end when the functionality is done, so to speak. So, I usually try to keep my pull requests relatively short. And I also insist, for the team at VBT to do that thing too, because otherwise you can't really grasp a pull request. So this means, either I'm going to do some minor use case. If it's larger, I'm going to split it as I go along. I try to make specs near the end of the writing procedure, because while I'm writing, it's still all in my head. So, I understand that code. Therefore, I don't need specs, and I find them somewhat limiting in the sense of, exploring things, because coding is way more than implementing. It's exploring, I don't really know exactly how am I going to solve it until I work on solving it, So that's why I basically don't write specs until the very end. There is some merit, admittedly, and I have been thinking about these ideas, both about specs and, again, I argue specs are documentation. So also about the documentation, like this happens with my open source projects. And also it happened with some, abstractions that I used to write, especially for my former company. So like I write everything, there are tests, everything is nice. I start working on the documentation and specs. And in the middle of it, I see the design problem as I'm writing the documentation, and I'm starting to think maybe I should do the documentation first, because that would, uncover it. So I still haven't tried it. And again, the problem is that I'm not really sure what I'm going to do until I start coding, So for better or worse, I have to explore things through coding. Sure, I spend a little time, or sometimes even more than a little, thinking and premeditating about things, but ultimately, whatever I come up with, it's like at best maybe 50% on the right track, and I have to code. So anyway, I try to postpone those things to the very end when the product is polished.
Have you read Hackers and Painters by Paul Graham?
I have, although 15 years ago, so I don't really remember anything except that he's using Lisp.
Yeah, he has that whole metaphor about the hacker as a painter, someone who needs to be able to play. It's a defense of dynamic typing, right? He basically says that, being able to throw together code without the imposition of a strong type system is invaluable to somebody who wants to move very quickly. And I think that's kind of why Elixir is the best of both worlds. And also, I was also going to mention, we need to have you and Chris Keithley on the show together.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to make that happen.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The real question here, though, is you mentioned, I think actually before we started recording, that you have a set of common abstractions and helpers that you've been building out at Very Big Things. We actually have something like that Eric's developed called Stein. I'd love to compare notes. Is this something that you can tell us more about? Like, what are some of the specific, most useful abstractions and helpers you've built out? Is it open source? Can we look at it? That kind of thing.
Okay, so it's still very early days. Currently, it's kind of open sourced more unintentionally. Well, I mean, there are no special or there are no professional secrets in there, but it's basically open source more for our convenience, in the sense that it was easier to set up, the CI and stuff like that. We are actually in the process of moving this to closed source simply to avoid polluting the public space, and then we want to have more structured way of open sourcing things, like more polished with a license and stuff like that. But anyway, so it's currently, I wouldn't say anything spectacular is happening here. It grows organically from the bottom up, so to speak. And so what that means is, as I read those pull requests and what the things that they are doing, and I mean, since I joined, there were I think 3 or 4 greenfield projects started. So, I've seen stuff happening from the very beginning in those new projects. And you can see that there are patterns repeating and emerging. And so I try to, when I see this repetition, I kind of try to extract it, but in a very gentle and conservative way. So I'm trying to be careful not to build these huge abstractions that, solve anything short of the world hunger. And I basically, want to go with maybe I'm going to solve part of your problem, but it's going to be very lightweight. And at least it's going to be kind of extensible and replaceable. And it's going to be something that you can actually grasp how it works. And when you go to the code, you're going to be able to read that code to figure it out, because it's not complex by itself, So some examples include some common logic for the authentication. We don't use anything third party. I basically kind of, suggested, and it was accepted that previously they have been using just Guardian, and I suggested that we stop using even that, and JWTs, so JWT tokens, right, at all. And we are just basically using Phoenix token mechanism. But there are, some nuances with authentication, especially on the business side. So you want to make sure that you're always validating or invoking password comparison, even when the user is not there. So to avoid timing attacks, right? And things like that. And the same thing with, say, password reset functionality. So we kind of extracted those things into a common helper. So basically, you just fill in the blanks. You say, this is my repo module. This is my account stable. And, the code solves that logic on the business layer, but you still have to implement the UI layer. So it's not going to do that for you. It's trying to be very lightweight. Another example is something which I'm hoping I'm going to publish soon, properly open source, or not me, we, the team, it's the whole team. And so this is the thing about operator configuration. So I was able to make a lightweight abstraction which bypasses and doesn't really use application configuration at all. This is, by the way, a thing where Chris and I strongly agree. We are sort of huge opponents of the mainstream style of using config scripts and app config. So I basically wrote this small module or helper which allows you to consolidate the operator config. And operator config is the stuff that you have to provide at runtime in the production system or the staging system, but the product itself. So the database connection, I don't know, AWS API key and stuff like that. And only those things are consolidated in that module. This is the Elixir code. It gives you strong typing. So it actually generates specs. So if I say that connection pool is integer, then it's going to convert it into integer. And the function itself actually is spec'd as returning an integer. This is what the abstraction does for you. You just say, I'm expecting a connection pool, and it has to be an integer, and everything else is kind of generated for you. So it gives you strong typing. It gives you compile time checks. If you write connection pool instead of connection pool, you're going to get a compile time error because you're actually invoking function and not some key from some magical key value store. And this thing can generate template configuration for operators. So basically you declared what are the input parameters to your system. And then you invoke a single command, mix run foobar, and it spits out .env file with all the parameters required. Those which are optional are commented and the default value is provided. Otherwise, it gives you which type you have to provide. When you start the system, if something is missing, then it's going to report that it's missing. Under the hood, it's using Ecto for these kind of things. So that's kind of interesting. This is something I'm really excited about. And so that's another example of things we did, but nothing super abstract and super complex.
It's good to hear that the helper library I've been working on is pretty similar to that. So it's cool to hear you doing something pretty similar.
Yeah, so I'm trying to this whole idea that I'm trying to instill, and a lot of it is based on my past mistakes, that I did as a programmer, is, trying to avoid these huge complex abstractions too early, because those tend to be quite rigid. And ultimately, they do more harm than they do good, But on the other hand, I mean, you still have to solve some repeating pattern and boilerplate. I mean, these days, I see when I look at Twitter, it seems that kind of pendulum swings. So, I'm from the generation, we were taught that, any duplication is bad, do not repeat yourself. And I remember back when I was still a student, I did part-time C++ teaching. And this is one of the things that I would teach, people who were learning C++, just, avoid duplication. Duplication is bad. Now, these days, we kind of enter, it seems to me sometimes that we go into this other extreme where, duplication is not bad at all. And it's neither, duplication can be an indication that something is missing. But of course, if you don't have a good abstraction, then it's probably worth delaying, extracting it into anything, because I do agree that wrong abstraction is way worse than a little bit of code duplication. Yeah. And I can testify, I had this library called Exactor, maybe you have heard of it, which was kind of trying to solve some superficial duplication on Gen server. And ultimately, even I gave up on using it because it was like a really wrong abstraction. And more recently, I just published, on GitHub, like, don't use this thing, please.
I think it takes a lot of courage to admit when you were wrong, especially after you've invested a lot into a project. So I admire that. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about training. The last question is specifically around testing, unit testing, feature testing. How do you train that into the organization? How do you encourage it? Talk a little bit about unit testing to start, because that's sort of what you mentioned, but I'm also curious how you do integration testing, feature testing specifically at very big things.
Yeah, so this is a very good question that, opens up a lot of teams. First thing, the team did testing before my time, and this is a good thing. They had a CI set up. They were writing a lot of tests, in fact. So that's definitely, not something that I had to, instill into their culture. However, what I noticed, and I don't really have a sample, but, speaking with people, I feel that this is a frequent practice, is that like these tests are kind of not really well grounded. And, what I'm going to say maybe goes against the mainstream of today's thinking, but I think it's important to say it. So a couple of months ago, I think maybe, I'm not really sure if I was even working with very big things. I said that like the modern notion of unit versus integration tests doesn't make sense to me at all. Because when you have a unit test, typically what people think is a test which tests a single class, for example, or a single module. And you kind of mock out everything else in a hexagonal pattern. And then if your test combines two classes or modules, then it's called integration test. And to me, this is pointless because, most tests would be integration, or otherwise you would end up with a bunch of mocks. And then I ended up, I stumbled upon a talk which is called TDD, Where Did It All Go Wrong? And so this talk is by Ian Cooper. It's about from a few years ago. And for me, it's quite possibly the most important technical talk of the past decade that I have personally heard. So I totally recommend this talk. And what Ian does is he basically goes back to the teaching of Kent Beck and Martin Fowler, and so-called, let's call them the original Agile crew. Basically, the big point is test behavior, not implementation details. And this really resonates well with me. And this is the kind of culture that I want to instill in very big things. And I think it has been working really well for us. And so what this means is, like, at the very highest level, I mentioned earlier, we are separating, context from the interface layer, like GraphQL, mostly in our case. So we are writing our tests first and foremost at the interface layer. We are testing, like, say, some GraphQL query field or mutation field. Now, the way this works is as follows. So you have like your classical test, AAA pattern, right? You have arrange, act, and then assert. So you basically bring the system into the desired state, then you invoke something that you're actually testing, and then you check the output, the return value, maybe some side effects, and so on and so forth. The way it works for us is then we say, like, let's say that I introduced a mutation which is called login, so for logging in. Or let's say that, we can speak in Rust. Let's say that I introduced a login action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke first in the arrange phase, I'm going to invoke register function from the context layer to actually register a user. I'm not going to insert it into database. This is an important thing, So database is an implementation detail, very important implementation detail. It cannot be swapped or something like that, but still it's an implementation detail. So I'm invoking a business level function to register a user. And then I'm going to invoke the, let's say, REST action to log the user in with those same credentials. Yeah, I see some surprised looks. We can expand on this a bit more.
So, this is what I think of as integration testing.
No.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's it's what we call it, right? So it depends on one's own
Or
definition.
feature testing, right? Like this idea that testing what the user expects to receive or get at the end of the day.
So for me, when we talk about integration testing, integration test would be like, how does my system integrates with an external system such as, I don't know, Twilio, Twitter, AWS, things like that. This to me means integration testing. What we're talking about here is still a part of that same system implementation.
So how does it differ from feature testing?
Well, in this particular case, we are certainly testing of, well, I wouldn't even call it, registration is a feature. Yeah, we're registering a feature,
Okay.
if you will.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I use integration testing and feature testing sort of interchangeably. I do know that people talk about integration testing to mean sort of like the integration, the interface. But sorry, continue. So go on.
Yeah, it's all about naming, So, I mean, but anyway, let's go back to this test and then we can expand some more. So, yeah, again, in the arrange phase, I will invoke the context function. In the act phase, we have settled on invoking the REST using Phoenix helpers. So we're not actually doing HTTP requests, right? Because Phoenix with its test helpers allow you to set up the con object, and then you basically, just go through the con object. And then ultimately, we will verify the outcome of, what this returns. And so the test could look like, for example, when we're talking about, say, login functionality, the test verifies the expected behavior. Like if a user successfully registered with some combination of login and password, they can also successfully authenticate with that same combination of login and password. Notice that there is like no database at all mentioned in the test. Of course, it exists behind the scene, right? But we do not like generate some factories. So database factories are pretty much abolished now from our project. And we basically want to set up the system in the desired state using the API. And this is important because it gives us confidence. And that's what we want from tests, So like, I want to say something controversial here. Like, I'm not really a proponent of very mechanical interpretation of TDD. So tests do not drive my development, requirement and analysis drive my development. So like, my superior or say my client comes to me and says, Saša, can you solve this problem for us? And then I do some thinking, or the team does some thinking. The outcome of that is that some code has to be written. And so this is what drives the development, the stuff that we have to produce. Tests serve to support the development in the sense that, we can write some code which gives us confidence that this thing is actually working as it's supposed to be working. In the process, of course, because tests are indeed the client of the code, one of the clients of the code, I may end up, opening up some like function in the module, or maybe returning some value which is needed only for the test. So in that way, tests do kind of drive the design as well, but tests are certainly not the main driver of the development. It's the feature that has to be implemented. And tests are there for me to give me confidence. Is this thing working as it's supposed to be? And so we start from the top level, the maximum possible level that we can. And that's for us, the API. In our case, it's actually GraphQL, but, it can be REST. And we drill down if we need to. So like, for example, let's say that as a part of the functionality, I write the cache service. So you can't really test the cache service through the API. Maybe the cache is not working, but the API is serving everything from the database, right? And so you need to go one layer deeper, like in the implementation. You will pick the abstraction and you will test its behavior, but you will still not do like hexagonals and mocks and stuff like that, because, it's still testing the behavior. And this is like the huge, big, important message that Ian sends, like test behavior, not implementation details. And he drives a very important point when you do refactoring, So by the very definition, when you go back to the Martin Fowler book, refactoring means that you're changing the internals of your code without changing the behaviors. And so tests, when you do refactoring, tests should not break, unless you made a bug,
What you're saying right now about focusing on the desired behavior in order to instill confidence in the developer speaks so deeply to what I've constantly been harping on at Smart Logic. Anytime we talk about testing, it's never about like 100% test coverage. It's always about, does this prove that your system works as you expect it to work? Like, does it allow you to refactor confidently? Does it allow you to deploy confidently? Like, it needs to enhance confidence. And so, yeah, when we were talking about the different terms, it was really just about getting on the same page semantically, because as far as the philosophy is concerned, I'm 100% in agreement with you. The person who put me onto this, I think initially back in my Rails days, was Justin Searles. So I'll shout him out and link to his blog in the notes. But yeah, continue if you feel like it about this example and sort of what your philosophy on testing is and why it's not exactly unit testing.
Basically, Ian makes a good case, so again, he goes back to the teaching of Kent Beck, like when you're refactoring and if your tests are very micro at a micro level, then the code is going to break and you're going to end up with, like say you change the name of a database table, for example, and a bunch of tests, use the test factories, and then a bunch of tests are going to break, even though the system is working and the code is working, right? And otherwise, if you have like these hexagonals, so you mock out dependencies, so you can test just a single class or a single module, and you effectively end up testing, like if I invoke function foo, it will invoke bar with the first two parameters and bars with the third one. What does it even mean? Like that test is completely unclear, but it's going to break as soon as you change something in internals, and you're going to get a bunch of errors. And I mean, Ian actually makes a very interesting case, which is kind of a lost and forgotten art. So the term unit actually, according to Ian, refers to the test itself, not to the thing under the test. Basically, the idea is, before this was like coined, this term, they had like tests which would trip over each other, so like you run foo and it compromises the outcome of bar, like two different tests. And so the term unit means that the test is a unit in a sense that it does not compromise the execution of other tests. Maybe you cannot run them in parallel. It depends. Either way, it means that like I can run foo and then bar, or I can run bar and then foo. And no matter what, does the test succeed or fail, crashes, unhandled exception, and whatnot, one test will not affect the outcome of the other. This is what the word unit means. And in that sense, even an integration test is a unit test. That also explains why you can use XUnit to write integration tests. For me, and again, I mean, this is what Ian also very nicely puts, but again, even this is not even his invention. He just goes back to the original teaching, like of Kent Beck mostly. So integration, what we spoke about earlier, is about integrating with external API, like say external microservice, like AWS client, things like that, So these are not the things that you normally run. You want to mock out those things because you don't want your test to say fail because the network is down or stuff like that. So this is something that, say, I would run maybe on a daily basis, like a nightly build to check, whether I'm actually using the real stuff as I'm supposed to be using. If that's possible to set up, of course, it always depends. So that's the integration test for me.
Yeah, and I guess this is sort of hopping back a tiny bit when you were talking about mocking. The other super scary thing with mocking, and probably why I haven't used like mocks or anything like that recent in Elixir times, is like if you mock out other behaviors, your tests are passing, but maybe they're actually broken because you've implemented the underlying details that are now changed, but your tests need to be updated. So that's another scary thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, I mean, you still aren't sure, that the whole combination of these things work, I asked the developer once I was arguing with, and I asked them like, okay, you're testing foo and you're testing bar, but how do you know that they work together? And he just said, I just know, but that's not really a correct answer, right? I want confidence. And this is what I want to ask, from every test, like you can do a kind of a Marie Kondo thing, if you will. Does it spark confidence? Because this is what the test should be all about. Exactly. And so if it doesn't, throw it away, And so, for example, we have this thing on a couple of projects. We started working at the context level. So the API with the front-end team was still not fleshed out. And we started working at the business domain level and implemented tests at the business domain. Once we added the GraphQL, the interface layer, we had to implement tests there because we want to make sure that it actually works as it's supposed to be working. And then, we had a discussion and said, okay, now we're going to throw away these domain level tests because they are basically duplication of the ones we have at the wider area of the code. Why would we want to keep the duplicate of pretty much the same thing, right?
Right. Ah, wow. There is so much there. And I'm so glad that we got into it because I think that testing is super duper important. Philosophy of testing is very, very important. You probably just saved a lot of young developers a lot of time and energy. So thank you, Saša. I think that is about time for us. Do you have any final plugs, asks for the audience? If you want to talk about where people can find you, where people can find the Erlangelist, anything that you want to ask from the audience, now is a good chance to do that.
No, I haven't really prepared for this, but like if you see me at some event, come and say hi. I like to meet people and hang out and meet different people. So otherwise, I hope that you enjoy this show. Take a visit at the Erlangelist. So I don't blog often, but at least when I do, I try to make it count. Maybe read Elixir in Action if you haven't. I hope you're not going to be disappointed. It has some good reviews. That's basically it. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming, Saša. It's really been a pleasure. Absolutely. Everyone listening, go check out Saša's material at the Erlangelist. Go check out Elixir in Action. As you know, we try to bring you a super high quality podcast. Saša has done an excellent job at creating super high quality written materials on the Elixir and Erlang world. That's it for this episode of Elixir Wizards. Thank you again to Saša Juric and my co-host Eric Ostrich. Once again, I am Justice Epen. Elixir Wizards is a Smart Logic podcast. Here at Smart Logic, we're always looking to take on new projects, building web applications in Elixir, Rails, React, infrastructure projects using Kubernetes, mobile apps using React Native. We'd love to hear from you if you have a project we could help you with. Don't forget to hit that like button. If you're listening somewhere with a like button, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast player. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Also, leave us reviews on your favorite podcast players. Those reviews really count for a lot, help us climb the charts, and make us the best Elixir podcast we can be. Also, you can find me on Twitter at Justice Epen. You can find Eric on Twitter at Eric Ostrich. Join us again next week on Elixir Wizards for more Working with Elixir.